Today, we're going to be learning about a man born into poverty, a man born with nothing, a man by the name of Gaius Marius, a man with nothing to lose, who started soldiering. This man, Gaius Marius, served under Scipio Africanus the Younger, also known as Scipio Aemilianus. And Scipio Aemilianus took a liking to the young man. Scipio Africanus, seeing the man's exploits, believed that one day he would be as prestigious as himself. Marius latched on to this belief that Scipio instilled in him and climbed to heights that a boy from his station might have never thought was possible. Early on in his career, he was put on trial for bribery, but he was acquitted. Marius married Julia in 110 BC. Julia was none other than the aunt of Julius Caesar, who at this point had not yet been born. This would make Gaius Marius Julius Caesar's uncle. If you watched the last video on the Cimbrian War, I mentioned that this was going to be the next video. And I also mentioned the influence that you see that Marius has over Julius Caesar. I want you, throughout this video, to take note that a young Julius Caesar, looked up to his uncle and saw all the things that his uncle did and would have heard all of the stories from before the time he was born. 3 men make up the late Republican era. And those 3 men are Marius, Sulla, and Caesar. Inevitably, I will be doing a life of Sulla and absolutely a life of Caesar. And at the end of that, there will be a comparison video of the 3. It's a very interesting topic because you see Marius, you see his influence on Caesar, and you see Sulla, and you see his influence on Caesar. It's just an incredibly interesting topic to cover these 3 men and compare them. Yeah, with that being said, we are fully going to get into the life of Marius. So as I said, in 110, he marries Julia, the aunt of Julius Caesar, who, again, would not be born for another 10 years. But again, just a soldier at this time, making his living, was very much liked by Scipio Aemilianus, which gave him, easy access to political offices, probably above his station or standing at the time. There's actually a story about Marius as a young soldier who disliked the varicose veins in his legs, which he is said to have, legs basically covered in them. So the surgeon got to work on Marius. Marius sat there quietly as the surgeon cut out these varicose veins, an incredibly, incredibly painful thing to endure. Something that the surgeon was thinking to himself, every time I've ever done this, the patient is howling and screaming, begging me to stop, and Marius just sits there completely still. The surgeon, thinking this must not be painful to him at all, began to cut the veins with reckless abandon, believing that Marius was not troubled by this at all. Once he had finished with Marius's right leg, and he went to move on to the second, Marius simply raised his hand and told the surgeon that it was not worth the pain, got up, and walked out. Now, is that story true? I mean, I don't know. It seems a little far-fetched for me, but this is trying to paint the picture of a young Marius as someone who was willing to endure the rigors of life, as he came from nothing and fought bravely, without fear, and not acknowledging his pain. During the war with Jugurtha, Marius would serve under Metellus, and through his efforts and advice won the favor of his soldiers and superiors. Marius was very well liked by the soldiers, again because of the advice that he gave and through his own military efforts. He was proved to be a competent strategist and leader, more so than maybe anyone in Metellus's camp. Turpilus, a friend of Metellus, accidentally aided Jugurtha. He allowed him entrance to a city that he did not know that Jugurtha was a part of the envoy. It was an honest mistake. Marius, who was presiding over this trial, sentenced him to death for treason. And later on, it was proven unequivocally that no treason had occurred. Marius still did not care and was happy with his decision, causing Metellus and him to enter into a feud. Marius ran for consul, slandering Metellus and promising to kill or capture Jugurtha, which Metellus had been unable to do to that point. I think it's important to point out that Marius was gleeful in the fact that he had just taken away one of Metellus's friends. This is a man who was, because of the favor that not only his soldiers, but a man like Scipio Aemilianus had shown to him, he kind of felt like he deserved, because of the favor of his soldiers and because of his success and because of the favor that Scipio Aemilianus had shown him, he was filled with a great ambition, and so he decides to go after the position of consul, all the while slandering Metellus, who he served under, and promising to kill or capture Jugurtha. Upon being elected, he had many poor men admitted into the army. He himself was from humble beginnings, so he felt as though he knew he could trust those men to be just as good as him. He was the first person to kind of give the poor men a chance. This kind of became a problem among the nobles because he would endlessly taunt them, mock them. He would always bring up their military failures, and he would say that their ancestors, if they could see them now, would disown them. He often would say how embarrassing it would be for them because their own ancestors would actually prefer men like Marius, as their ancestors were men who came from nothing, just like Marius. So now to see their offspring born in a better position with all advantages and still being worse military leaders would break their hearts. The masses loved Marius for this. In the hearts and minds of the common people, that's exactly who Marius was. Just another common guy, standing up and succeeding. Metellus effectively wins the war. All of the major territories are captured long before Marius gets involved. But as he wins the consulship, Marius means to take that triumph and the glory away from Metellus by capturing Jugurtha. So Jugurtha, he seeks refuge from Bocchus, a king and his son-in-law. However, Bocchus decides that it's in his best interest to betray Jugurtha. Sulla, who we've mentioned previously and is going to be brought up quite a bit here, was a quaestor at the time. And Sulla had arranged that Jugurtha would be surrendered to him. Bocchus, he kind of had this problem where he didn't know if he really wanted to do this, if he wanted to sell out Jugurtha. He even concocted a plan that when Sulla came to take Jugurtha away, he would actually kidnap Sulla. He thought it over and he decided to go with his original plan, and he betrayed Jugurtha, who he had originally promised aid to and pretended to protect. But now that he turned him over to Sulla, the war was officially over, and Marius would get the credit for this. However, many of Marius's detractors at the time attributed all the first successes of the war to Metellus, which was partly true, and they said that Sulla was in fact the one who ended the war by capturing Jugurtha, so very much downplaying any of Marius's involvement, which, mind you, Is it fair to say Metellus was the commander, and even if he followed the advice of Marius, and even if Marius did well in winning battles or setting up strategy to win these battles, it was still Metellus's consulship that the success happened under. And Sulla was personally responsible for the capture of Jugurtha. After all, Bocchus surrendered Jugurtha directly to him. Now, obviously, if you're a detractor of Marius, it's very easy to take those two facts and downplay all of Marius's involvement. The reality is obviously in the middle, where all three of the men were integral to the victory in the Jugurthine War. Marius, celebrates a triumph for Jugurtha, for capturing Jugurtha, and during this triumph, while he's celebrating his victory over Jugurtha, he wears his triumphal robes into the Senate. Just, if it wasn't bad enough to the aristocracy and the nobles of Rome, now this man was flaunting his triumphal robes in the Senate chambers, showing a clear disrespect for the Senate. Now, Marius would go and change his wardrobe and, almost making it seem like it was an accident. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. It still attracted much ire from the senators. However, it also gained him much more popularity among the masses. Marius was undoubtedly a great general and had played an integral part in winning the war against Jugurtha. Upon seeing this, and here, really, I want you to think about this. No one had ever worn their triumphal robes into the Senate before. It was a massive, massive sign of disrespect to the senators to do such a thing. And he did that. And you can say it was an accident, but based on what we know about Marius's character, of how he would so openly mock the nobility of Rome, I think you would have to presume that there was a bit of tact to this maneuver. Now, it's important to note that at this time, if you've watched the Cimbrian War video, this is after Carbo has failed his ambush against the Cimbri, and this is after Silanus, and this is after Silanus and Longinus are defeated, and this is after, obviously, the disaster at Arusio. The people of Rome are terrified of the Cimbri. They have just won 4 back-to-back massive successes, slaughtering the Romans at every turn, massively outnumbering them, and easily destroying any military force that was put against them. So the fear of these Cimbri was immense in the Roman populace, and this made them elect Marius as consul, believing that out of all their leaders, he was the only general, he was the only man capable of defeating the Cimbri. And Marius, having studied Scipio Aemilianus and being a personal friend of his, knew that just like he had done in the Third Punic War, one of the most important aspects to winning a war was getting the men properly prepared. So Marius naturally spends the next years training up the men to make sure they are ready to fight the Cimbri. Now, fortunately for him, the Cimbri, after each victory, just keep progressing further and further west. And eventually, after the disaster at Arusio, where they killed over 100,000 Romans, one of the bloodiest battles in Roman history, let alone Republican Roman history, they still pushed west, and they actually went into Iberia, where they fought a bunch of Celtiberians. Again, I'm not going to go too in-depth with the Cimbrian War because the previous video was that, but if you missed that, they fight against the Celtiberians, and they lose, and this causes them to come back to Italy. Now, years have already passed. 2 or 3 years to this point have passed, and Marius has had all this time to train up the men. But I'd like to talk about something that happened before the Cimbri came back. Lucius was the nephew of Marius, and he had command over a good bit of men. And although he was said to have been of good character, he had a weakness for beautiful youths. A man in his command named Trebonius caught his eye. Many times indeed, did Lucius try to seduce Trebonius, but he always failed. One night, after being rejected one too many times, Lucius ordered Trebonius into his tent. And since Trebonius could not refuse a direct order without committing treason or mutinying, he went to his commander's tent, and there Lucius tried to violate Trebonius. Trebonius, fearing for, what was about to happen to him, raised his sword and killed Lucius, the nephew of Marius. Lucius was dead, a man well liked by the men, again to have said to have good character, but those that knew him did know of his weakness for handsome young people. When Trebonius was on trial for killing him, not one person came to his aid, and Trebonius had to stand trial defending himself against the litany of accusers. Trebonius spoke honestly. He told of all the bribes offered to prostitute himself to Lucius, and how he never acquiesced, not even once. Marius, hearing this, thought this was incredibly noble. He gave him a crown for bravery that he personally put on Trebonius's head. Again, this is more evidence of, Marius is not somebody who's going to push nepotism. Just as he wouldn't have had that luxury, he's not going to extend that luxury to his family. He wants the common man to feel seen and heard. So in this, when he has the opportunity to punish someone who's killed his family, he not only saves him from death, he exalts him and gives him a crown for bravery, for standing up for himself and doing what Marius would have done in the same situation, which again made him more loved by the everyday common man. But at this point, he had been waiting for the Cimbri for 2 years and going on a third. Now the Cimbri have made it back, and so Marius sets out to fight the Cimbri, specifically the Teutons and the Ambrones, who are all in kind of a coalition together. But if you watch the Cimbrian video, I break this down a little bit. In general, there are the Cimbrians, but this specific group was the Teutons and the Ambrones. Now, the Teutons, led by Teutobod, fight a battle at Aquia Sextia. Now, mind you, the Cimbrians have completely wiped the floor with the Romans in every engagement, and they still outnumber them massively. Marius shadowed them for a long time, and the men were getting increasingly frustrated with Marius. They said, "We've trained for years for this, to be cowards, to watch them as they rampage around." Marius just implored the men to trust him, and he said he was so happy that they were so ready and willing to fight. Eventually, Marius let them walk right past him. It was said it took upwards of 3 days for all of the Cimbrian forces to get through the mountain pass, all the while taunting the Romans, telling them that they would be with their wives soon, asking them if they had any messages they'd like to give to their wives. But as soon as the last boot made it through the pass, Marius shadowed them closely and waited for the opportunity to strike. The Battle of Aquia Sextia was fought basically because of a mistake where the servants went into the water and the Ambrones came and fought the servants of the Romans, and this led to about 30,000 Ambrones being slaughtered. Marius then, a few days later, sets up a battle at Aquia Sextia, outmaneuvers the Teutons magnificently, and slaughters over 100,000 of them. Now Marius has effectively beaten half of the Cimbrians' force. That was the Teutons. There's still the Cimbri, which is, again, another 120,000 plus strong. But nonetheless, his consulship is over. So he is now back in Rome. And Marius is trying to get an unprecedented 5th year in a row consulship. His friends, they do everything they can in the Senate to help him get elected. And it really wasn't that hard, because knowing that the Cimbrians were still out there and were still a threat, especially seeing that he was the only man who had success against them, and such massive success indeed, it was easy to get Marius elected to a 5th consulship. And again, this is where you have to look at this. This guy wore his triumphal robes in the Senate, built up the power of the people every chance he could, built up the common man, built up the poor man in the military, showed how far you could rise, and then was elected consul for the 5th year in a row, which nobody had ever done before him. At the Battle of Vercellae, Marius kills, with his only 50,000 men, they had more than double their forces. They slaughtered over 120,000 of the Cimbri. Marius, and I talk about this in the Cimbrian War video, he says a lot of very interesting lines to the Cimbri before they fight. He taunts them and explains how their brothers have permanently land to be settled in now. And he says, if you really want, we can have you join them, and you can embrace them if you wish. And they do get that wish if they wanted it. Now, something that needs to be brought up in this video for the life of Marius is that Catulus is actually responsible for winning the Battle of Vercellae, which finishes the Cimbri off. Marius's troops kind of get lost in the dust that kicks up, and they go right by them. And this actually means Catulus, with only about 20,000 men, defeats over 120,000 Cimbri. It's an unthinkable victory, on par with Aquae Sextia. It's incredible victory. Marius, when he won the consulship for the 5th time, turned down a triumph for Aquae Sextia and was awarded 2 triumphs for his victories over the Cimbri. This cannot be overstated, guys. The Cimbri had won 4 battles against Rome, okay? Massive victories in each one. And in many of them, they were disadvantaged, and they should have lost. But due to poor Roman planning, they were able to come out on top. The Cimbrian War cannot be understated. I mean, Rome and the borders were effectually for years ruined because of the Cimbri's influence. And, okay, if they had lost the Battle of Vercellae or the Battle of Aquae Sextia, very much Rome could have not existed. Rome would be an entirely different thing, with an influx of 500,000 Cimbrians. The entire shaping of Roman history would be different as we know it. It's totally possible to think Rome itself would not have survived, and it certainly, even if it did, would not have survived in the way we know it today. So Marius literally is the savior of Rome. And I feel as though this gets overlooked a lot. And I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on this. Now, in Rome, he's awarded 2 triumphs for this win, for this victory over the Cimbri. But he shares one of them, but he splits it. Instead of taking 2, he takes 1 and gives 1 to Catulus. Now, Catulus, after the fact, most likely, almost certainly influenced by Sulla, says that Marius wanted all the credit. And Sulla even makes a comment that Catulus backs up, that Marius arranged the troops at the Battle of Vercellae in a way that his men would receive all the glory for the battle, putting themselves on the wing and Catulus in the center, thinking that they'd be able to encircle the enemy and, be responsible for the victory. Obviously, that's not the way it worked out. I find this to be something, and I'm going to touch on this now, and even though this technically would happen a little bit later in the timeline, but Catulus going against Marius and siding with Sulla is purely political. And Catulus saying that Marius was greedy and wanted glory is kind of a ridiculous statement, because Marius was the consul. Much like how, even though Marius might have been the mastermind in the Jugurthine War, in the war against Jugurtha, Metellus is the one who many people gave credit to the victory for. And just like Sulla then masterminded the capture of Jugurtha, Marius, as the consul, took credit for that. And in the event specifically of the Battle of Vercellae, Marius organized the troops in that way. You can say he set them up and he wanted to be the main victory force. You don't really know. The matter of fact is, with Marius' strategy, you were able to win the battle. So, and obviously Marius was responsible for Aquia Sextia before, so it's clearly a competent general, clearly knew what he was doing, and still gave you credit and was happy to share his triumph with you for your victory. Now, again, you can say that's politically motivated because the soldiers apparently instigated or insinuated, Catulus' soldiers insinuated that they would stop a triumph if Catulus was not awarded one. But still, I find Marius to be just in this endeavor, and why wouldn't he be? He loved his soldiers, and he had the support of his soldiers, of his men, and of the common poor people, and of the common man. So it stands to reason to me, and it seems that he just gave Catulus credit because it was the right thing to do. And Catulus kind of just throws this in his face. And I find that to be strictly because Sulla was the prominent political force at the time, and Catulus decided it was in his best interest to side with Sulla. This is as good a time to mention as any that Marius and Sulla were lifelong rivals and could not stand one another, which I know is very funny when you realize that they're both the inspiration for Julius Caesar. But they absolutely detested each other and were rivals. And this starts because Sulla captures Jugurtha and even has a ring made of him being surrendered to him. So, in a way, Sulla is trying to campaign and rally for his credit in ending the Jugurthine War, when really that was to go to Marius, which then, obviously, Marius' detractors use Sulla and Metellus' successes against him. When again, a lot of this was coordinated and overseen by Marius himself because he was the consul, and before that, he was Metellus' probably best advisor in that war. So, there's so much going on here, when you break it all down. But Sulla, it all starts with him, with Jugurtha being surrendered to him. That's what kind of starts this rivalry off. And then Sulla is at the Battle of Vercellae serving under Catulus. So he really wanted it to be known that, and Sulla had said many times in his own memoirs that he served under Catulus, which is very funny because they served under Marius. Marius was the consul. So even though he might have been a soldier in Catulus' army, which, by the way, there is disputes on that. Some say that he actually served in that battle in Marius's ranks, but we'll let that one slide for now. Either way, the consul of that was Marius. Marius did not need to share that triumph with Catulus, but he did anyway. So for Catulus then in the future to retroactively acclaim Marius to be so glory hungry is kind of disgusting. But I digress. Let us get back to what's at hand. So Marius' fifth consulship comes to an end. Unprecedented fifth consulship. But Marius was not satisfied. He wanted a sixth consulship. And the thing about Marius is, in times of war, his leadership was perfect. There was not a better man for the job. And again, I really need to emphasize how important a victory the Battle of Vercellae and Aquia Sextia were. Over 120,000 Romans is one of the greatest losses in Roman history. The Battle of Cannae, which is widely regarded as one of the greatest defeats in Roman history, was about 88,000 men. The disaster at Arusio was 80,000 soldiers with about 40,000 camp followers and such, so 120,000 Romans were killed. Some people like to dispute this number. I am going off what we have. So either way, it was a extremely large number of Romans killed, and I think the numbers are quite accurate. If it wasn't 120,000, it's probably 80,000 total. It was an immense number. Obviously, you don't attribute as much success in these in this victory. Like Hannibal gets so much respect for Cannae because it was due to his tactical brilliance that they won that, whereas the disaster at Arusio is due to the incompetence and arrogance of the Romans. Anyway, I digress. But Marius, like I said, was clearly the best leader of the time, and he stopped the Cimbri, who 4 other men had tried to stop and failed disastrously. However, we're now getting to the central problem of Marius. As a civil leader, Marius just wasn't good. Nowhere near. I mean, Marius' skill was that of a general. That is where he thrived. When it came to civil matters and social matters, Marius was near inept. He didn't have the charisma or the social graces to be well liked. So instead of kind of standing by principles and what he thought was right, he would be swayed by whatever the masses wanted. Marius always followed the mob because to him, that was the best way of him staying in power. In this consulship, he was running against Metellus, who was very distinguished in his own right and well liked by the aristocracy. The nobles of Rome very much thought Metellus would be a better consul than Marius. This is the son of the previous Metellus. So it was said by Rutilius that Marius bribed large members of the populace to vote for him. Due to this alleged bribery, Marius won his 6th consulship. The only person to do this besides him was Corvinus, whose consulship was spaced by allegedly 45 years, give or take. So Marius is the first now. He just did an unprecedented 5. He's now done a 6th consulship 6 times. 6 times in a row. It's honestly, you have to realize how insane that is. I mean, think of a president winning 6 elections, it's a very big deal. Again, as I said, Marius, great leader when it came to warfare. Not so much. Is just a civil servant. With Marius' 6th consulship, while obviously the unprecedented 6th consulship came, a lot of discontent came with it. Marius had a friend named Saturnius, a man who had a political rival by the name of Nonius. Saturnius didn't want to deal with Nonius, and so, with the assistance of Marius, had Nonius killed. This was a major blow to Marius' credibility. I mean, this kind of intrigue is the things that the common people despise the nobility and aristocracy for. And now Marius had kind of engaged in that. And that was okay, and, perhaps people could have turned a blind eye to that, but then Saturnius tried to pass his agrarian law. Now, we're not going to get into the specifics of the agrarian law, but what we will talk about is how he forced a clause into this law that said that every single senator had to take an oath swearing that they would abide whatever the common people voted for, and they would not dissent against it. Marius spoke out in front of the Senate, in front of Metellus, this great man who was admired by the nobility, and he stood with them. He said, only a fool would ever take an oath for something so stupid, so ludicrous, so irresponsible. All of the nobles agreed. Metellus was kind of in a shock. He couldn't believe that Marius, the man who had been the champion of the people, who had just been swung by whatever the masses wanted, now was here saying that it was in the Senate's best interest not to swear this oath, not to give the people this power? Well, finally, Saturnius gathered them all together and said, "It's time to take the oath. You will openly refuse or you will openly support." The masses gathered around to hear what the nobles would do, what the senators would do, who would be for the people and who would be against. And the nobility were very, very happy because they felt like Marius was going to back them up and back up the traditions that the Senate had established through the years. Well, to much of their horror, as Marius stood up there first, Marius took the oath right there in the Senate. He had snaked them all into a public place where he had accepted the oath to give the people the power and not go against them. And now, surrounded by those masses of people, the senators would have to say that they refused to take the oath. They couldn't do it. One by one, each senator went up there and they took the oath, promising not to go against the votes of the people. Metellus could not believe this backstab, and the nobles in the Senate hated Marius now more than they ever had before for this backstab that he had done to them. Out of fear for the mob that was gathered around, each senator accepted the oath, all until Metellus arose. He looked on sternly at the crowd and his friends in the Senate, and the nobles begged him. They said, "Metellus, please, just take the oath." But he refused. Metellus said, "Any man can do good and refrain from evil, but the true sign of a good man is doing the right thing even in the face of danger." Saturnius, seeing that he refused to take the oath, used this as his ability to banish Metellus from Rome. The crowd, in an absolute uproar, clamored and screamed that Metellus must be condemned to death. However, luckily for Metellus, many sympathizers were in the crowd, and they formed a wall around him to protect him. But Metellus arose to speak, and he said, "No faction shall be formed on my behalf or in my name." He said, "Either matters will mend, and the people will change their minds, and I shall return at their invitation, or, if matters remain as they are, it is best that I should stay away." Metellus was exiled, where he spent most of his time studying philosophy in Rhodes. And obviously, this was all done. This whole entire thing was done in the end to keep Marius in power and favored, and not allow someone like Metellus to get support to oust him. So this is just a lot of snaky politics that he's involved in that really is kind of all being headed by Saturnius. This is all Saturnius's mastermind work. Marius is just along for the ride. He's not this great orator who can just get the people on his side. The only way he's now getting the people on his side is by just agreeing with whatever they want. And that's really not a good thing, but that's the only way he can stay in power. Now, a bunch of nobles, they were very much against Saturnius, and they believed that he was the one corrupting Marius, because despite how hostile he had been to the nobles, he still had a lot of reverence and respect for Marius. Again, this man saved Rome. This should never be disregarded. They tried to incite him against Saturnius, but Marius had already actually been meeting with Saturnius and had him hidden in his house by another room. Marius was trying to speak with both of them at the same time, and it is said that in order to, not arouse the suspicion of Saturnius and the nobles, he kept telling both of them that he had been suffering from diarrhea. That's why he had to run away every 5 minutes. Which is, I mean, good excuse, I guess. Um, but eventually, the nobles find out what was happening, and they started a small insurrection, which Marius quickly marched his men into the forum, shut off the water, and obviously the insurrectionists surrendered to Marius almost immediately. Marius then did try his hardest to save the men's lives. He insinuated that though they did wrong, they should not be put to death. However, that did not matter at all, as every single one of the insurrectionists was immediately put to death in the forum. Marius's public opinion was at an all-time low, and the office of censor came up, which, is a respected position, but Marius, out of fear that he might lose, turned down running. He said that he did not want to burden the people of Rome with his having to be in their everyday lives. Eventually, Metellus is brought back from exile, and Marius keeps fighting in the Senate to block this. But eventually, he realized that, there's kind of no way to stop this. Metellus is coming back from his exile. And so, Marius, kind of thinking now, hey, I'm going to be cast to the wayside. No one's going to listen to me. He sets sail for Cappadocia. Now, he tells everyone he's going there to make sacrifices. Allegedly, he really went there to try and spark war with Mithridates. The reason that, and this is again, I don't think that there's enough evidence to really suggest this definitively. He did meet with him. They had conversations. The theory is that he wanted to spark this war with Mithridates because he would almost certainly be given power over Rome again because he was Rome's best general. And again, he had, all of his success and fame and all the support came in times of war when he was winning and being successful. That's what he was good at. But when it came to all these political machinations and being a charismatic, well-liked figure, that just wasn't Marius. That wasn't who he was. He was a common man, a man who came from nothing. He had ambition and tactical know-how. Marius then constructed a house in the Forum of Rome. He used to complain often at this time that less and less crowds would form around his house than others of note. And this irked him very much, and he had a few excuses for this, but like I said, the reality was that sixth consulship had done much to taint his image. Most of the public opinion of Marius was just what I've been saying. He wasn't really a good civil leader, and in times of war, he was the man for the job. So, seeing as there wasn't any major war, he was kind of cast to the wayside. He wasn't especially charismatic, and he didn't really have much social graces. Again, he wasn't from nobility, so that was all very foreign to him. But out of all the successes of people that he disliked, nobody irked him more than the rise of Sulla. Sulla's popularity was rocketing at this time. Pretty much, Sulla got all of his notoriety and success from the nobles who hated Marius, because all of Sulla's early political career was about slandering Marius. I mean, every kind of critique you hear about Marius that I've just said is all kind of used by Sulla. And obviously, like I mentioned before with Catullus, he's even getting former friends. Friends might be a stretch, but former people who served under Marius, who would have liked him, who would have thought of him well because he was good to his soldiers and won great victories and shared that triumph with Catullus. And still, now that Sulla is the primary political force, they're now retroactively changing their stories and saying, actually, Marius is this glory-seeking, power-hungry man. And there is truth to that. But for Catullus to say that is very interesting. I'm going to, again, this comes to a head when Bocchus, that king who surrendered Jugurtha over to Sulla, erects this monument that he gifts to Rome that shows Jugurtha surrendering to Sulla. Marius was furious at this. He saw this as Sulla directly trying to steal the glory of his achievement. Now, again, when we talked about this, it's important to note that Marius was given the triumph. Metellus certainly had his reason, his success in the war, and Sulla certainly did get Jugurtha surrendered to him. Sulla was quaestor under Marius's consulship, so Marius should get the credit for the capture of Jugurtha. Also, Metellus, while Metellus was the consul, and so even though a lot of his successes were through the advice of Marius, still Metellus should get the credit for his victories as consul. But again, I emphasize that Marius should get the credit of ending the war and capturing Jugurtha. So, again, Marius was furious. He saw this as Sulla trying to take his credit, and Sulla was furious because he saw Marius as trying to push him down. The civil dissension between these two was so great and was building so much resentment in not just the nobles and the aristocracy, but the everyday people. It was boiling to such a problem, and it might have burst if it didn't already burst in the social war, which again, if we're going to, I'm definitely, just so you guys know, if you're watching this video, I'm 10,000% going to do a video on the social war. This is going to be a super long video, by the way. I know it's the life, this is the entire life of Marius. I'm trying to condense it as much as I can. But the social war, this did a lot for Sulla, expanding his popularity and power. This detracted much from Marius's power. Marius was already an old man at this time, in his 60s when this war takes place, and Marius was actually 66. Many of the men and many of his other generals complained that he was very slow to attack, and he hesitated. But, the reason I'm not going to critique him for that is that Marius was always extremely careful and always was slow to act, waiting for the perfect moment. And that is perhaps what made him such a great general, is knowing his moment to strike. And despite this, and still being at an advanced age, he won a very great victory in the social war, where he slaughtered 6,000 of the enemy. It was a great victory. Marius was never going to be forced into a fight he did not want. And one of the most revered generals for the rebel insurrectionists of Italy was Silo. And Silo's men met with Marius's men who were fortified on a hill. And Silo ran to the bottom of his embankment and looked up at Marius and said, "If thou art a great general, Marius, come down and fight it out with us." To which Marius answered, "Nay, but do thou, if thou art a great general, force me to fight it out with you against my will." Which I just think is a perfect kind of encapsulation of Marius. He had an answer for everything, this guy. But it's I think this is a great display of his character. This is a great display of his military mind. He's not going to get forced into a conflict he doesn't want to engage in. Even the rebels' best general doesn't actually want to try him because he knows that there's a good chance that this goes south for me. But unfortunately for Marius, and this is again, he loses much credibility in this war because at 66 years of age, he began to become infirm. And he just wasn't able to lead the troops in the same way that he did in his youth. So he actually gives up command of his troops. Obviously, Sulla does a very good job in the social war, gains much acclaim and praise, and this is where, his political rise, again, you have to kind of figure, it was kind of 50-50 before this, as everything was coming to a head before the social war. But the eruption of this social war and the Italian rebels led to Sulla gaining that next step of popularity. However, and this is where things get kind of interesting, During the Mithridatic War, it was proposed that Marius should be proconsul, and he should be in command against Mithridates as still one of the best generals. Now, half of the people of Rome were rooting for Marius, wanted Marius because they figured he was the most experienced and best general. But the other half had really become enamored with Sulla. So obviously, bad blood's still there. These two are still competing for this viable position. Marius shook off all the infirmities that he faced in the social war and was constantly at camp with the younger men training. Marius, by this point, had amassed an immense fortune, and he had an incredibly expensive house that he left on the daily to train. Many of the soldiers were pleased to see him down there amongst them again. And they had heard all the great stories of this man. I mean, again, the man who saved Rome, Gaius Marius, here training with us, an old man now. However, for the other half of Romans, they saw a man who came from nothing. And even though he came from nothing, he still wanted more money, more recognition. How could he not be satisfied with all he had? Half of the people just thought, go enjoy the baths, old man. Go enjoy your riches in your house. What more do you need? Half of Rome was ready for Marius's 7th consulship, and the other half believed it was now time for him to go quietly enjoy his life. Marius was going to set out and fight Mithridates' satraps. Now, a lot of people, that again, his dissenters were like, what is the point of you, as an almost 70-year-old man, going to war? And Marius's excuse was that he wanted to personally train his son. There was a man by the name of Sulpicius who basically was another Saturnius clone, if you will. And he surrounded himself with 600 bodyguards that he called the anti-Senate. So you kind of get the sentiment of what he was about. And it was not about being a friend of the Senate. So Sulpicius used them actually to attack the two current consuls, causing one of them to flee, and the other, Sulla, to try and escape the mob by taking refuge in Marius's house. There's two stories of this. One is that Sulpicius, just for the ease of my pronunciation, used his 600 men and tried to kill Sulla. But Sulla escaped to Marius's house, where Marius aided him, protected him, and got him away safely. In another version of events, Sulla's version of events that he writes about in his memoirs, he said that he went to Marius's house not to escape, not out of fear. Sulla simply went to Marius's house to consult with him and try and better understand the demands that were being made, Sculpinus's demands. Marius sent 2 tribunes to take over Sulla's military force. However, Sulla, who, agreed to whatever they imposed upon him, just told his men not to comply. And they cut down and murdered the two tribunes sent to take a command. Sulla then ordered his men to march on Rome. Again, this is kind of the first instance of this. And again, if you're aware of another guy, what he does, you can definitely see the inspiration for that in this. Sulla's march on Rome. 35,000 men. And Marius tried to rally together enough of a force to stop it, and it's said, the sources kind of mock him and say it was a pitiful defense. What choice did the guy have? There was nothing he could have done against 35,000 hardened soldiers. There was nothing that he could have done to stop that. And Sulla, realizing, hey, you can kind of take power by force, this is a massive turning point in Rome. Now, Marius, realizing with Sulla in power, he was now going to be the number one target. And if he was caught, he would be killed. He took his son, he took his family, and he fled. He sent his son to get supplies, and he took his stepson and sailed away. Marius' son was almost caught, but managed to barely avoid capture and escape. Marius spent much time going to and fro, all different woods, hiding out in the forest, hiding out in villages, hiding out wherever he could. Everywhere he went, he was trying to avoid his capture because he knew that he would be killed if he was caught. Marius, all a while throughout his entire exile, would lash out, and Marius would often speak to anyone of his entourage or anyone who would listen and promise them that he would get a seventh consulship of Rome. And even when his men were at their absolute lowest spirits and they thought that everything was going to come to a really bad end, Marius would assure them that he would get a seventh consulship. Marius had been bouncing around from place to place trying to avoid capture, and a local fisherman took him in, hid him. But enough news had traveled, and they knew where to look for him. So Marius, trying to evade capture, threw off all of his clothes and tried to hide in a swamp. Unfortunately for Marius, he was found, and he was marched into Minturnae naked. The law that had been stipulated at that point, that had been sent out to all Roman provinces, was that Marius was to be killed by his captors immediately. However, the magistrates of the town still decided that they would deliberate. They put him in the house of a woman named Fania. When Marius was consul, he actually presided over a civil case between Fania and her ex-husband. She wanted her dowry, and he didn't want to pay it. She was a promiscuous woman. Marius, absolutely fed up with the both of them, found them both to be deplorable, ordered that the man pay Fania's dowry, but she would have to pay 4 copper for being impure. Now, many thought that Fania would be increasingly rude, holding resentment for that against Marius. However, that could not be further from the truth. Fania often tried to lift Marius' spirits while he stayed in her home. Eventually, the magistrates decided that they would sentence Marius to death. And so they set for the task of finding the man who would carry out the order of death on Marius. They asked every member of their town, and not one person stepped forward to kill Marius. They said, who would? Surely someone would be willing to kill Marius. And they knew just the people to go to. They found a Cimbrian man, a barbarian, the very people that Marius had destroyed. Between the soldiers, the men, the women, the children that had ended their own beings out of fear for what would happen, likely over 400,000 casualties caused by Marius to the Cimbris. Surely this man would kill Marius. That Cimbrian barbarian walked into Marius' room late at night. All he could see was Marius' eyes, which he said were like a flame. Marius' eyes burning bright in the darkness, pierced into the Cimbrian man, as Marius, waiting on the man, uttered, "You, dost thou dare to slay Gaius Marius?" The barbarian ran out of the room, screaming, "I cannot kill Gaius Marius," throwing his sword into the ground and outright refusing to kill him. The magistrates, now seeing that they had no one who would be willing to kill Marius, decided to exile him instead. Knowing Sulla's guards would be upon them, trying to capture Marius, They carried him away, trying to save Marius's life. But they had to go a roundabout way, as there was a holy place in between Marius and the sea. But one man stood up and said, "If it's an effort to save this man's life, even though we are forbidden to travel through this holy place, we shall carry him through there to save him." And that is how this town not only refused the orders of their magistrates to kill Marius, but carried him through holy ground to save his very life. What self-respecting Roman would kill the man who saved Rome? Eventually, after his escape, Marius learned that his son had survived, evaded his captors, and made it to Africa. This made Marius very, very happy, and he decided to set sail for Africa to try and rejoin with his son. He had to make a short stop in Sicily, where 16 members of his party were caught and killed, and he narrowly escaped to Africa. However, once Marius landed in Africa, the governor of Africa, who had neither really been a fan of Sulla nor Marius, came to him and told him promptly that he would be treated as an enemy of Rome. Marius felt very defeated. He wished that there was some way he could overturn this, but there was no words. He was left speechless, and so he just stared at the ambassador sternly, that old way of his. He stood at the ruins of Carthage, and he lamented his own fortune, how it had gone from bad to good, back to bad, much like that of Carthage itself. Marius' son, knowing that the governor would give them no assistance, sought refuge with the Numidian king. However, the Numidian king would not permit them to leave once he had granted them entry into Numidia. Marius' son realized that this could not end well. And so, knowing that a concubine of the Numidian kings was madly in love with him, he used her to help him and his men escape. Eventually, father and son were united on the beaches of Africa, where they embraced. But quickly, knowing that Roman and Numidians were on their trail, they quickly set sail. They set sail for Susina, narrowly escaping the horsemen that were charging down the beach after them. Sulla had been busy fighting Mithridates, and at the time the consuls Octavius and Cinna fought. This is another war we could cover briefly, but it's I'm probably just going to cover it here. Octavius won the day and installed Cornelius Merula as his proconsul. Cinna was outraged and raised forces to start a war against Octavius. Marius, knowing that Octavius was very, very well liked by Sulla, rushed to the aid of Cinna, saying that if he made him proconsul, he would give him all of his support. Cinna gladly accepted his support, and now Marius was his proconsul. Marius, as soon as he landed in Italy, quickly set out to work, captured port city after port city. Marius, again, Rome's greatest general to that point, the man who saved Rome, was now trying to get back into power, and an active enemy, an insurgent against Octavius, their current consul. However, the people liked Marius, and having Sulla be nowhere near off fighting a war, Octavius lost favor quickly, and the people rallied behind Metellus, thinking he was the only one who could stop Marius. But Metellus wanted nothing to do with the people, and Metellus, having turned them down and bidding them to go back to Octavius, left Rome. Octavius stayed in Rome, and a few men who had been sent forward by Marius and Cinna murdered Octavius. The Senate urged Cinna and Marius to take the city without slaughter. Cinna absolutely agreed. He did not want any bloodshed, but Marius just stared at the senators. He offered them no answer. So finally, when it was time for them to enter the city, Cinna entered. He had a bodyguard, but Marius stopped at the gates. They were curious. Why have you stopped, Marius? What? We permit you entry into the city. And Marius said, I was exiled. Until the vote has been rescinded, I cannot enter the city, for I am a law-abiding man. The masses formed to rescind the vote, and they gathered at the forum. Only 3 or 4 votes were cast before Marius dropped all pretense and entered the city with his bodyguards, former gladiators and slaves, who murdered anyone that Marius wanted with a simple nod of his head. Cinna quickly lost his appetite for vengeance, but Marius, it was said, day by day grew more and more bloodthirsty. This was Marius's chance to get revenge on all the people who had wronged him. He spent that time in exile, and he lamented all of his great misfortune, but he knew that he would have his day. Marius was slaughtering anyone who was a political dissident of him. Anyone who failed to show respect to him was murdered. So some absolutely did escape capture through cunning, but most were slaughtered. Marcus Antoninus, who was the grandfather of Marcus Antoninus of the Julius Caesar era. But yes, he was a great orator, very well respected in Rome, very well liked. Unfortunately, he was sold out by a slave and an innkeeper, purely by accident. Marius was informed of Marcus Antoninus's capture. He almost jumped from his chair, clapping with such joy and glee. And he wanted to rush over to the house he was being held to personally kill him himself. But his friends managed to calm him down, and so he sent Annius and some soldiers to kill Marcus Antonius. However, Antonius was such a good orator that the soldiers who had been tasked with killing him were weeping at his speech, and they were not going to kill him until Annius, sensing that something was wrong with how long it was taking them to kill him, ran upstairs, began to shout at him and curse him, seeing what he was doing, and cut off his head. Marius did not forget any grudges. Next, he made his way to Catullus. All of Catullus's friends urged Marius, pleaded with him, please let Catullus live. He's done nothing. You must spare Catullus, Marius. He's a good man. But all that Marius ever replied to any of Catullus's friends' pleas was this: he must die. Catullus, knowing what was coming for him, locked himself in a room, lit charcoal, and suffocated himself to death to avoid whatever fate Marius had in store for him. The Bardier, or Marius's bodyguard, which had entered the city, were incredibly cruel, slaughtering not just those that Marius wanted, but whoever they felt like, and violating whoever they felt like. This led Cinna and Sertorius to sneak into their camp at night and kill all of them to end their reign and bloodshed. Finally, news broke that Sulla had finished the Mithridatic War and was returning home with a massive army. Marius was elected consul for the 7th time, just as he had promised all of those in his exile. A man named Sextus Lucinus was thrown down the Tarpeian rock. Marius began to reflect on the coming war with Sulla. He was 70 years old at this point. He was driven to great angst, and he could find no ability to sleep. So, to medicate that, he would spend most of his nights getting incredibly drunk. Sulla was still younger and fresh off of a war. Sulla had already previously once ousted Marius from Rome. Marius' nightmares were so bad that he would hardly be able to get any sleep without drinking, and he said that he heard a voice speaking to him, saying, "Dreadful indeed is the lion's lair, even though it is empty." Marius waited for Sulla's return. It is said that while he was about walking with his friends, they began to talk about the events of his life, beginning with his earliest days under the tutelage of Scipio Aemilianus. And he recounted his frequent reversals of fortune from good to bad and from bad to good. And he said that it was not the part of a man of sense to trust himself to fortune any longer. After this, he was bedridden for several days before he died. And that ends the life of Marius. It was said by some of his dissenters that he was resentful that he never got to command the Mithridatic War. It's said by some of his dissenters that he went a little loopy at the end of his life and believed he was the commander of the Mithridatic War. Marius died 17 days into his 7th consulship. His son took over power, and that is the end of the life of Marius. This is obviously an incredibly long video, and any video I do that's going to be about like the future ones, I will definitely be doing the life of Sulla and the life of Caesar, and a video comparing the three. But any video I ever do that's going to be, a life of and examining a person's life is going to be lengthy. I'm not going to put this in a tier list because I'm just going to be rating him as one man. So, I'll use the tier list ratings that we have, but I'm not going to make a tier list for one guy. Unequivocally, I put Marius in fair enough. And so I can't sit here and say Marius is a good man. I can't say he's just. I can say that I understand Marius. You have to understand Marius. This is a guy who came from nothing. His military ability was spotted by Scipio Aemilianus, so he knew there was something there. I think what Marius had was such a disdain and hatred for the nobility in the Senate that he kind of let that blind him to righteous actions in certain times. You can take a lot away from Marius. What you can never take away is that Marius saved Rome in the Cimbrian War, unequivocally. Unequivocally saved Rome. Unbelievable victory against unbelievable odds that everyone else had failed before him. For that alone, you have to understand the magnitude that he should have been revered, but wasn't. And much to his own fault. But at the same time, this is what made people love him. Being that common man of the people, that's what made people love him. He was fighting this inner war inside of himself between this anger and the justice, and he just could not find the balance. Something that I find very ironic is that he starts his career kind of slandering his consul in Metellus. Sulla gets his start in politics from slandering his consul, which was Marius. So Marius hates him for this, and it really resents Sulla. But Sulla just did what Marius was doing, which, again, especially if we're talking about literally the life of Marius by Plutarch, it becomes so anti-Marius because everything is warped through the lens of Sulla. And that is, so even the bloodshed that's said to have happened, I don't know that you can really say Marius was as bloodthirsty as is said, because that was a massive political point that needed to be made for Sulla's second. Well, we don't want to spoil anything. We're ending it at the life of Marius. Marius died after his, 17 days into his 7th consulship. My point is that let's just say that the historical account of how bloody he might have been could be exaggerated. One thing's for sure, the political opponents who did side with Sulla were absolutely punished with death from Marius. And maybe, just maybe, I'm not saying that's justified, but I can say that if I, as a consul, shared a triumph with a man, and then that very man said that I was a glory seeker and I was too ambitious and my whole life was about greed and ambition after I shared a triumph with him, I think if and then that man allowed my rival to get in power, which then had me forced into exile, I think I would probably have similar ideas to how to handle it as Marius did. So it's very hard to judge Marius based on that. But again, I can't say he's just because he does all the same things that would aggravate him. What happens with Sulla, he does the same thing. In terms of being a civil leader, there's sometimes he does good, there's sometimes he does bad. He's very hit or miss. He engages in political assassinations. Again, he backstabs the Senate. So just because you're backstabbing the Senate and you're helping the people and the masses, and that was what he was about, it doesn't mean that it's a good. Being treacherous, one way or the other, is just a moral bad. Where Marius, I have to put him fair enough, is I don't know that if I was in Marius' shoes, I could do things that much different. So I am putting Marius in fair enough for his life. I think, was he a good man? No. I don't think Marius was evil. And I think Marius gets a very bad rap due to the political turmoil that he was in. And I think you have to really look at the sources through their political lenses in dealing with that. Marius was a huge inspiration to obviously his nephew and Julius Caesar, and even more so, you really have to look at, so many people credit Sulla for shaping Caesar. Marius, Caesar would have heard about him wearing his triumphal, at the time he wore his triumphal robes into the Senate. Caesar would have heard about his fifth straight consulship, then his sixth straight consulship, and he would have been alive for the seventh. So these are things that Caesar saw. Caesar saw how all of his power was derived from the people, how he gathered up such plebeian support, and how good that did, and how much good that did for him. Caesar was able, to really emulate so many things that Marius did and had. I mean, it's Sulla himself who says, I believe the quote is, this might be botched, but I believe the quote is, "There's many Mariuses in that Caesar," something along those lines. But yeah, I mean, it's an incredible. Marius is one of the most tumultuous figures in Rome because he set up so much of him, and Sulla effectively set up the end of the Republic without them really knowing, but that's what they do. At the same time, Marius, and to some extent Sulla, saved Rome. I mean, Marius literally saved Rome. So it's such an interesting life, such an interesting character. There's so much more you could go into about Marius. And this was already a super long video. And thank you guys so much for watching. But yeah, I really want to emphasize Marius. You cannot understate the Cimbrian War victory. And you cannot understate how nuanced this all is and how this man lived his life. And yeah, it's just, there's so many parallels between him, Sulla, and Caesar. It's just an unbelievable story. His life is really an interesting one. And I hope you guys enjoyed learning about the life of Gaius Marius. Thank you.